Tonight's story takes you far away, to a valley hidden beneath silver moonlight, a place where the air is soft, the grass whispers with the wind, and time itself slows down. In this valley lives a dragon, not fierce nor frightening, but gentle, a guardian of dreams, watching over all who rest beneath the stars. As you listen, let your body relax, let your mind drift, and let the story guide you into peace. There is a hush that belongs only to night, a hush that seems to fold the world into a single steady breath. In Moon Valley, that hush arrived before the stars were even fully awake, settling over the rounded hills and the soft meadows, the way a mother settles a blanket over a sleeping child. The day's colors slipped away without hurry. Gold to rose, rose to violet, violet to blue, and in that blue, the first lanterns of skylight began to open one, and then another, and then so many that the darkness itself looked gently freckled. It was the kind of evening that did not ask for attention, only for quiet company. And the moon, patient and bright, was already climbing the low rim of the earth. Moon Valley was shaped like a cupped hand, its fingers formed by hills that leaned close together, as though sharing a secret. Between those hills ran small, listening streams, their voices whispering around smooth stones that had been polished by centuries of lullabies. Trees grew where water met land, willows with silken hair that brushed the water's face, poplars that kept still and watchful, and white-barked birches that seemed to glow from the inside when the moon peered through. The meadows were soft with grasses that bowed at the lightest wind, and with wildflowers that closed their petals at night, the way eyes close in trust. As evening gathered, the valley's creatures began their quiet rituals. Field mice stitched tiny paths through the grass, following routes known only to their nimble feet. Deer moved like drifting thoughts along the meadow's edge, hooves muffled, ears cupped to the night. A fox, bright-eyed and careful, paused with one paw lifted, as though considering a question only it could hear. And above, the night birds, owls with low, careful wings, unfolded from their hidden perches and slipped into the sky like secrets shared softly. It was in this place, in this hush, that the moon rose in her pale glory and poured her calm over everything she could see. Her light was not the brilliance of noon. It was a gentler glow, a soft and steady breathing. It laid itself on the meadow grasses and made each slim blade shimmer with a fine thread of silver. It gathered in the stream's bends, where water turned slow and thoughtful, until the curves shone like scattered mirrors. It rested on rooftops in the small village, tucked at the valley's heart, turning thatched straw to gray silk, and brushed against windows where candles dwindled and final words of the day were tucked away like socks into drawers. Within the village, doors latched lightly, mothers and fathers smoothed blankets, tucked in toes, and kissed brows. A kettle was lifted from a stove, the whisper of steam fading into the soft-shelled night. A broom swished one last time across the threshold. From somewhere came the thin, wavering hum of a lullaby, not loud enough to go far, but the kind of sound that lingers in the eaves and remembers to be kind. Even the old church bell, which had rung dusk and day for half a century, kept silent now, as if mindful not to disturb the slow, deepening quiet. Farther up, where the valley's hand curved into a knuckle of stone, a narrow path climbed. It passed through ferns and under ivy-laced arches, taking its time to shoulder around a boulder and then another, until it reached a moss-curtained cave that looked out over all the resting world. The cave's mouth was a mouth only in shape. In feeling, it felt more like a window or a listening ear. From there, one could see the line of the moon's light on the streams, the faint thread of chimney smoke unwinding, the tidy patchwork of fields set dark and still. The wind here was thoughtful and clean, carrying the meadow's sweetness and the forest's quiet breath. And always, it carried the smallest sound of water thinking itself along stone. The valley had a way of making even the distant feel near. The mountain peaks, though truly a day's walk away, seemed no more than a glance further than the church steeple. The stars, which could not be reached by any ladder, seemed to hang leisurely, just beyond the last branch of the talus poplar, and the moon, her soft coin of light, seemed so companionable that a child might wave to her from a doorway and believe, justifiably, that she had waved back. In Moon Valley, time wore slippers. Seasons drifted in and out without harsh edges. Spring opened like a book with fresh pages. Summer lay down in the grass and exhaled. Autumn folded its brightness gently. Winter drew the kilts close and asked everyone to speak softly. Even the storms, when they came, were greeted as guests who might bring their own loud voices, but would eventually find the valley's quiet irresistible and soften into rain, then mist, and finally, the kind of memory one feels on the skin but cannot quite name. On this night, the first night of our tale, nothing pressed. There were no urgent footsteps, no clatter of gates, no messages run up the path. There was only the accumulating peace of a place well acquainted with rest. The moon had a way of teaching, and her lesson was simple, that stillness, kept faithfully, is a kind of love. Beneath that lesson, 100 small lives softened into a rhythm. The slow in, slow out breath of sleepers. Practical hum of the earth, turning itself like a careful page. If one stood in the meadow and listened closely, the night offered a dozen gentle sounds. Cicadas stitched a steady thread along the fence line. Water, in its many small tongues, translated the mountain's coolness to the valley's floor. Wind fingered the willow leaves and made a soft, glassy murmuring. A distant sheep turned in its sleep and sighed, a sound so light it seemed borrowed from a dream. Somewhere, a door eased open and then closed a last look at the stars, perhaps or a final word to the garden. All of it folded itself into a lullaby without a single word, and one could feel the village leaning into it the way a child leans into a shoulder. The valley was not perfect, because nothing that lives and breathes can be. There were days of muddy boots and broken handles, of a fence gap or a leaky roof. Yet even the small frictions of life seemed tended by the place itself. They never grew sharp enough to cut the night. Perhaps it was the moon's steady attendance. Perhaps it was the streams forever reteaching what it means to move and soften and go on. Perhaps it was something else, a feeling that the valley was held, watched, and cared for by more than rain and sun. Children, especially, felt this. They would stand at the edge of bedtime, Johns blooming like little flowers, and listen to the grown-ups' voices lower and blur, and in that blurring, they would sense the valley's old, kind heart. They might not have known the word sanctuary, but they knew how it felt, safe and wide and near. They knew that the shadows on their ceilings were just folded pieces of moonlight, and that the wind at their windows had learned their names and meant to soothe them. Up at the cave, the moss lay like soft velvet, cool and green, and the rock behind it held the day's warmth just long enough to give it away to the night. Leaves caught the moon's pale wash and turned silver at the edges. The path, barely visible, wrote itself in faint lines where the grasses spoke a little lower. If someone had been there to watch, they might have felt the cave itself, listening not with ears, not like a person listens, but in the way an old place attends to what it holds. Watching the village, listening to the wind, letting the night's small stories lift and settle, lift and settle. The moon rose a little higher, making the valley's shadows grow longer and softer at once. The thatched roofs became circles of gray down. The hedges turned velvet dark. The streams drew bright commas into the script of the land. On a windowsill, a cup cooled. On a doormat, a pair of little shoes leaned into each other. On a pillow, a child's hand unclenched, the day's last thought padding away on silent feet. And overhead, as steady as the beating of a large, gentle heart, the owl's wing passed by and did not disturb a single leaf. This is how Moon Valley prepared itself for sleep, not by shutting down, but by turning toward its own quietness. As a flower turns toward light, the village welcomed the hush. The hills cradled it. The streams braided it into their murmur. Even those who remained awake watchers by sickbeds, bakers preparing tomorrow's loaves, the shepherd walking a slow circle by his gate, felt the peace like a shawl around the shoulders. It did not ask them to sleep. It simply promised that sleep, when it came, would find them easily. And so the first part of our story ends not with a happening, but with a settling. Moon Valley lies under the open hand of night, the silver of the moon laid softly over every living thing. The world here is not empty. It is full of gentleness, full of small, faithful sounds, full of the kind of light that does not dazzle but blesses. The valley breathes in and breathes out. The stars lean closer. The streams keep their whispering. Somewhere, beyond the moss-curtained cave, something listening and kind is also at rest. The night has begun, and it is a good night. High above the valley, above the scalloped line of hedgerows, above the soft-shouldered barns and the silver-threaded streams, there rose a slope of stone that had learned the language of moss. It was not a cliff so much as a great, slow thought that the earth had taken time to finish. Along its sides, ferns made their careful fans, and ivy stitched quiet seams from shadow to light. If you looked from the village square, it was only a darker gentleness among gentleness. But if you climbed the narrow path that wove among saplings and dew-dark rocks, you would find the opening that the birds knew and the wind remembered. A cave, veiled in green, with a mouth like an old story about to be told. The cave's threshold was soft and cool underfoot, as though the day had laid its fever down there, and the night had come to comfort it. Threads of moonlight reached through the curtain of hanging moss, laying pale bars upon the stone floor. Inside, the air was steady and patient, with a scent of dripping lichen and damp earth, the faintest sweetness of crushed fern. Water talked in the back of the cave, not with a stream's rush, but with a slow, faithful counting of drops, one and then another, and then a pause, just long enough to remember why it is good to be unhurried. This was the dragon's home, not a hoard of gold, not a hall of iron, but a sanctuary woven from quiet things. He had shaped it with care, not by clawing or breaking, but by listening. Where the wind wanted to pass, he let it. Where the moss wanted more shade, he turned his great body a fraction and gave it. Where the stone had a curve that gathered light beautifully, he polished it with the gentle sweep of his scales until the moon could pour herself there and rest like a silver pool. He was large, as dragons are, but in the way of mountains and ancient trees, not imposing, only complete. When he lay along the cave's curve, his length gentled the shadows, and his breath introduced a rhythm so calm that even the sleeping bats above seemed to dream in time with it. His scales did not gleam like coins, no. Their shine was the quiet shine of water at midnight, a luster that revealed itself only when the moon leaned close. Some were the color of fog, some of soft ash, and some, along his spine and crest, held an interior glimmer, as though each had captured a sliver of star and kept it in trust. His eyes were pools of dusk, deep and reflective. When he turned them toward the valley, their surface held the small lights below lamps and windows, a lantern in a barn, a shepherd's swing of flame as he checked his gait. If ever a fire stirred in that gaze, it was not the blaze of anger, but the steady, hearth-like glow of kindness, warming itself against the world's chill stories. He knew those stories of dragons who roared and burned, but he held them the way one holds a cracked bowl with both hands, careful, gentle, refusing to drop it, refusing to use it. His wings, folded now, were like two fields of silk laid over one another, each rib a soft arch, each membrane a fine vellum of twilight. When he spread them in the cave's mouth to stretch, the moss lifted and settled like sighing lace. The sound was not a thunderclap, it was a page turning. On the ridges of those wings, fine veins glowed faintly, not with heat, but with the pale fire of things that have lived long and chosen peace. He did not often fly by day. The sun was generous but untiring, and his heart loved intervals and pauses. Night suited him, the rooms of dark, arranged around a single wide window of moon. His hoard, if a gentle dragon may be said to have one, was made of found quiet, a curve of driftwood worn to silk, held where the wind gathered a low note and sang through it, a blue-white feather from a heron, tucked in a crevice where dew could silver it anew each dawn, a bowl of smooth river stones he had nudged together with a careful claw. They were gray and unexceptional, except that when the moonlight came, they shone as if they remembered being rain. There was also a wreath of withered leaves that children had once woven, left on a rock near the path years ago. He had lifted it with a breath, only a breath, and set it in a niche where time could soften it without erasing its shape. Sometimes, when the world was between breaths, the moment after a breeze passes and before another answers, the dragon would hum. It was not a song with notes a person could catch, not a melody a flute might echo, but the low, warm hum of a hearth, remembering the hands that built it. The cave knew that hum and amplified it, sending it along the moss threads and into the stone, so that the rock, old and serious, could keep it for later. On certain nights, the hum wandered farther than the cave. It left with the breeze and combed the valley, smoothing the grasses, steadying a horse's ear, settling a nervous barn cat, lifting the corners of a baker's sleepy mouth. He was not lonely. The night kept him company. Owls would come to rest in the stray branches that leaned into the cave's mouth, bright coins of eyes blinking in the silver air. Moths stitched untroubled paths through the curtains of moss. A small family of mice had learned his great paws never hurried, and had made a home behind a stone that his tail often warmed. The dragon shared without counting, as mountains share their shade. When winter pushed a thin wind down the path, he shifted so that it would break upon his side and make a gentle eddy where the mice's doorway waited. When spring brought a rain so fine it was more like music than weather, he held his wings just apart so that the ferns beneath could drink without drowning. If a traveler had strayed near, he would have felt no fear before he felt awe. The dragon's presence did not press against the skin. It enveloped softly, the way a deep lake envelops a stone and smooths it. His breath was warm, and it smelled faintly of cedar and rain on dust. When he exhaled, the candles of the village, far below, sometimes flickered, brighter for a moment, as though woken by a blessing. He did not consider himself a guardian, and yet he guarded as naturally as birches glow or streams speak. He watched. He listened. He lent his warmth to the night. He had memories a great many, because the slow pulse of dragons stretches far, but they came to him as small, bright pieces without sharp edges. He remembered a morning when a child, too young to be frightened by legends, had wandered up the path with a sprig of thyme and the unsteady purpose of someone bringing a gift to a friend. The dragon had kept very still, letting the child's eyes grow large, not with terror, but with wonder. And when the small hand set the thyme upon the stone and patted it, he had breathed a little warmth so it would not wilt. The child had smiled a new moon of a smile and whispered, "Good night," though the sun was high. Good night, the dragon had thought. Yes, good night can be a way of saying, "I trust you." He remembered, too, a winter when the valley's streams froze in their shallow places and the deer found the grass curtained by ice. He had flown then not for spectacle, not in a blaze, but low and considerate, drawing the hush of his wings over the fields so that the snow lay smooth and the deer could find patches of heather still whispering. Those who saw him later described a passing shadow under the stars that made them feel briefly braver. They slept better that night, and in the morning they could not say why. But most days, most nights were simpler. He rested. He watched the moon part her veils and climb. He touched the stone with his warmth and accepted, in return, the stone's ancient ease. He refolded his wings with the care of someone putting away letters that belonged to a quiet joy. He listened to water count. He blinked slowly, the long blink of a creature that has found no reason to hurry its seeing. Beyond the cave, Moon Valley breathed. Lamps dimmed and went out, The roads narrowed into tracks a rabbit could cross without thinking. The streamside alders made their soft gestures. The dragon's gaze traveled over all of it without asking anything to be different. He did not wish for the valley to be grander or smaller, wilder or tamer. He loved it the way one loves a sleeping friend, completely, and with a promise to move gently nearby. Sometimes clouds obscured the moon and made the cave's light fold inward. On those nights, the dragon brought his glow to the surface of his scales, only a little, like embers remembering their flame. The cave brightened to a calm dusk, and the moss gave back the light in a green whisper. It was enough to keep the bats curving softly, the mice brave in their tiny errands, the owl's head cocked in approval. When the clouds thinned and the moon returned, he let the glow go, because sharing light is easier when a greater light has returned. He did not speak. Dragons seldom do. But in the way of old, gentle beings, he lived in sentences the world could read. His turning was a clause, his hum a comma, his stillness a period that ended an old fear. And every night, when the moon rose and found him there, their quiet companionship wrote a line upon the valley that even storms could not erase. From the village, if anyone had climbed part way up the path and turned to look back, they might have seen nothing more than a dark curve of stone and a curtain of moss slightly lifted, as if by a hand. They would not necessarily have seen the dragon, for he knew how not to show himself unless there was a need. Yet they would have felt that same shawl of calm settling over their shoulders, that same invitation to breathe slowly and let the day unspool. They might have smiled without knowing why. They might have said, to no one in particular, "Good night," and the valley would have answered, yes. In his cave, the dragon lowered his head upon his forepaws, and the cave received it like a blessing. The moon hung higher, and the streams rehearsed tomorrow's glitter. The world, held so gently by shadow and silver, drifted a step deeper into sleep, and the dragon, whose heart had learned to make lullabies out of breath and warmth, kept watch the way a candle keeps company unassuming, steadfast, ready to glow a little brighter if ever the quiet should tremble. Stories travel faster than truth. They run along fences and slip under doors. They cross winter fields in a single breath and arrive in children's rooms before the candles are blown out. In the village at the heart of Moon Valley, the old stories about dragons had arrived long before any villager had climbed the mossy path to the cave. Those stories wore armor. They roared with a dozen borrowed throats. They stamped and smoked and rattled windows in the telling. And when the telling ended, they left a little echo behind, the kind that lingers in rafters and tries to speak again when the wind slides through. And yet Moon Valley had a way of keeping its balance. The same bell that called the villagers to weddings and harvest feasts also told at twilight in a tone so patient it softened even the sharper stories. Grandmothers, who could recite ballads about fire and ruin with perfect memory, also knew the quieter verses, the ones that no one clapped for, but everyone needed. If the children asked about dragons, they were told the wild versions first, because children love the thrill of a safe shiver. But as night went on and yawns widened, the grandmothers' voices lowered and the edges of the stories rounded. There are many kinds, one would add, smoothing a quilt. Some are fierce, some are wise, some are tired, some are gentle enough to hold a moth and not crush it. The children nodded, as if the world had just made room for them again. If anyone had watched the dragon through the nights, they would have learned how far the legends missed. He carried no smoke, only warmth. He did not claim the sky. He borrowed it, and always returned it unruffled. When he breathed, the cave's breath joined his, and the two together sounded like a distant sea that had remembered to be calm. When he moved, even large movements, an unhurried shift, a careful lift of his head, contained the courtesy of someone mindful of dishes on a high shelf. The wild creatures of the valley wrote their own testimony about him with the simple script of their lives. The owls, who dislike nonsense, came and went through the moss curtain as if it were a favored library's door. In the soft hours before dawn, a hedgehog made a tidy path past the dragon's resting forepaws to the place where a tiny mushroom pushed a tiny shoulder through damp loam. Bats circled, counting blessings with each tight turn. None of them made the sounds that animals make when fear is near: the sharp clatter, the bolt, the ragged breath. Instead, there was a practical confidence, the kind that comes when night knows night. Below in the village, the stories shifted as the years did. A mason who worked late one autumn night swore he had seen a great shadow pass between the stars and the ridge, and that when it did, his shoulders, stiff from lifting stone, loosened all at once, as if someone had warmed the muscles with steady hands. He went home and slept without turning for the first time in weeks. A shepherd, who liked to understate everything, admitted that on a winter's evening, when the lambing ran long, he felt a soft draft he could not explain, and found his lantern burning steadier, though the wind had every right to snuff it. Like standing leeward of something kind, he said. And that phrase found its way into the market talk, into kitchen chatter, into the small places where truth likes to sit. Even the water seemed to testify. On certain nights, when the moon rose through a thin veil of cloud, the streams flashed not with their usual silver, but with a deeper, honeyed light, as if a second moon had leaned close. Children who could not name the feeling would point and say, "The river is happy." Their parents would smile and say, "Yes, it sounds like it," because the water's voice, that night, ran with a wider, easier note. Every now and then, a traveling storyteller came to Moon Valley with a satchel of grand disasters. Knights who rattled like cupboards full of pots, princesses who never learned to tie their own laces, and dragons that scorched whole maps from the minds of frightened listeners. The villagers were polite. They bought the honey cakes the storyteller sold. They laughed at the right moments, and they put coins in the straw hat at the end. But when the storyteller asked for a bed in exchange for a story, and the evening thinned and the children leaned into sleeves and shawls, the villagers told their own version back. It did not sparkle as bright, perhaps. It did not crackle. It did not ask the heart to sprint. It asked the heart to rest. "There is a dragon here," the blacksmith might say. Hands clean at last. The day's soot settled. If dragon is the right word for a creature that makes less noise than a cat on a stair. The baker would add, "If you listen in the blue before dawn, there's a hum that steadies the hand when you score the loaves." The midwife, who knew the wide range of breathing, laboring, gasping, sighing, sleeping, would nod and say, "There is a breath in this valley that seems to encourage all the others to find their best rhythm." No one claimed to have seen him clearly. No one tried to measure him. The story had exactly the shape of what it needed to be: spacious, kind, unafraid. The dragon knew about the other kind of stories. He felt them the way one feels weather before it arrives. A bristling at the edges, a restlessness in the leaves. On some evenings, when the wind came from far markets and carried the clatter of careless tales, he would lift his head and listen, not to correct, not to argue, but the way a tree listens while children run beneath it, taller than their fear, patient with their noise. He did not wish the fierce dragons away. The world is large enough for many truths. He only wished that in the catalogue of possibilities, a quiet place would be reserved for a creature like him. So he lived that wish. He practiced gentleness the way others practice scales or prayers. When birds fell asleep against his side, he held still long after his muscles asked to move. When frost came early, he exhaled a measure more warmth into the cave so the moss would not blacken. At dusk, when the sun's last color is a thin seam along the earth's rim, and the moon's first color is a silent wash over the trees, he watched the valley without wanting a single thing from it. That wanting nothing was a kind of blessing too. Over time, the village children grew to recognize a certain softness in the air on nights when their thoughts had been running too fast. It often arrived after tears, the clean, new breath place that follows a cry. Curtains lifted in a room where the window was closed. Shadows arranged themselves into calmer shapes. The child who could not sleep would roll onto a cooler patch of pillow and feel, for no reason that could be seen, the sense that something large and steady had taken up a post nearby. The child would sleep. In the morning, no one would name a dragon. No one needed to. The fruit was enough to understand the tree. An old teacher, long retired, but still the one children sought out when a kite caught in a birch or a thought snagged in the mind, kept a book of simple truths. In it, he wrote lines that could be read before breakfast or at night, lines that did not exhaust themselves by being read once. When asked about monsters, he wrote, "Some are in the world, some are in us, some are only in the chair by the fire where stories hang their coats." When asked about heroes, he wrote, "The ones we notice are not all the ones we need." And one spring night, after he had climbed halfway up the path to the moss-curtained cave and sat on a stone, not to look hard, but to look softly, he wrote, "Loudness is not proof. Rest is not surrender. The gentlest thing in the valley may also be the strongest." The dragon, unaware of the teacher's lines, but living them all the same, continued his long, careful companionship with the valley. He learned the winter constellations and the summer ones. He learned which barn roof held a tinny echo and which one turned sound warm. He learned the span of the bell's note and the exact moment each night when the streams lowered their voice by a single measure. He made no vows. Dragons do not speak that way, but the world could read his promise in the way he kept time, present, tender, thorough. Every legend asks for witnesses, and Moon Valley provided them without fuss. A mother at a window with a fussy child felt a hush pass over the house, as though a wing had shaded it, and the child slept with its cheek against her heart. A mule, stubborn at a ford all spring, walked through quietly on an evening when the sky held both a scrap of sun and a slice of moon. A candle, down to its shyest flame, brightened inexplicably for the last sip of a prayer. Small, ordinary marvels that did not need trumpets. The villagers stopped telling the noisy tales so often. They did not forbid them. They simply forgot to reach for them. And so the legend of Moon Valley rearranged itself, as gentle hands rearrange blankets on a sleeping form. The dragon in this story did not frighten sleep away. He brought it close and set it down where it belonged. He did not prove his goodness by feats. He let his goodness be felt in kitchens and fields and along the edges of dreams. If there was a roar in him, it was the silent roar of a great heart, beating steadily through the night, telling the valley without words, without hurry, that peace was possible and already, quietly, present. When the moon rose full and unclouded, she washed the cave and the slope and the meadow paths with a single patient light. The dragon lifted his head and looked out, and every place his gaze rested seemed to rest a little better. The old stories, rattling in distant rafters, fell quiet for a while, as if remembering a part they had left out, and the valley slept and dreamt not of armor or ashes, but of water turning in silver loops, of soft wings that could cover a village like a blanket, of scales that shone not like danger but like comfort. In this way, night after night, truth took its time, and because no one hurried it, it found its home. Storms do not always arrive with fury. Sometimes they come as a suggestion, the air leaning in, the horizon gathering its skirts, the leaves speaking together in a new, brisk murmur, as if they have received a private letter from the sky. On the day the storm came to Moon Valley, the sun wore a thin brightness that felt a little far away, like a smile from someone already turning to go. The chickens scratched shorter rows, the cats made brief patrols, and then chose doors sooner than usual. The baker, lifting his last tray, paused with flour on his knuckles and listened, as if a thought had stepped into the room that he could not yet name. By afternoon, the wind had loosened its manners. It ruffled the fur of the hillside and ran its fingers backward through the meadow's hair. Weathercocks pivoted thoughtfully, then less thoughtfully. In the hedgerows, the sparrows told each other brisk news. Far up on the stone slope, at the mouth of the moss-curtained cave, the dragon opened his dusk-colored eyes and watched the invisible shape of the air as it gathered itself into longer lines. His breath stayed steady. Calm begets calm, and he knew that storms, like anxieties, are best met with a patient chest. The first clouds were not dark. They were the color of doves, wide-winged and layered, sailing in ranks that thickened almost imperceptibly. Beneath them, the light turned silvery and directionless. Shadows, which usually knew their places, wandered and then folded themselves away. On the fields, hayricks hunched like thoughtful old men in coats. The shepherd made a tight circle of his gait and counted noses with a hand that had learned to count by touch. In the village square, a boy brought laundry from the line in a heap that smelled of sun and grass, and his mother, laughing softly at the haste, thanked him and smoothed the heap into orderly folds. Then the sky lowered, as ceilings do when the house wishes its family to draw close. Swallows flew low, snipping the air with quick wings. A kettle rattled on a hook. Somewhere a door banged and then was firmly latched. The bell rope, moving by itself in the odd breeze, thumped once against the stone of the tower. Even the streams grew more talkative, as if they had urgent news to deliver to their stones before the rain took up the conversation. The dragon rose and stretched one wing and then the other. The moss lifted and settled like a patient breath beneath a blanket. He stepped to the lip of the cave and looked over the valley. Nothing in him tightened. He had seen bigger storms and smaller ones, brief tantrums and long lectures. He knew this, too, would have its arc, its gathering, its outpouring, its long, thoughtful leaving. Still, he watched as one might watch a child struggling to fall asleep attentive, prepared to help if help would help, content to wait if waiting would be kinder. When the first drop fell, it was a large, careful drop, as if the sky wished to introduce itself politely to the earth again after a long absence. It darkened a circle on the dust, and then vanished into it. Already a memory. Another followed, then 3, and the porch stones dotted themselves with tidy coins of wet. The smell rose at once, rain on old dust, that cousin of relief which makes even the weary stand up straighter. Women came to doorways and pulled in small rugs. Men checked the fit of shutters, resting palms against wood, the way one feels the forehead of someone who might take a fever. The rain arrived in earnest, curtains of gray, drawn and then drawn again, until the distances vanished, and the world became a room with many soft corners. The thatch drank and darkened. The roads melted into simpler shapes. The trees went from stippled to smudged, and then to silhouettes. The sound filled everything, not like a shout, but like a crowd murmuring kindly in a station. It was the sound of new lines written over old ones, of parched things saying thank you without words. Then the thunder began. It came first as a long, distant furniture moving, the sky rearranging what only the sky can lift. The children looked up at their ceilings, listening to that deep scraping, as if giants were setting down careful chairs. The dogs shifted and lay closer to ankles. Another roll followed, nearer and more certain, its core a warm drumbeat wrapped in velvet. And then the lightning soft at first, a flash like the opening of a curtain in a room where someone naps, a bright glance, and gone. The dragon watched the river of light the way one watches a thought pass through a friend's face. Inevitable, not to be seized, only to be honored by a steady presence. But storms have moods, and this one, after politeness, spoke its mind. The rain strengthened and then strengthened again, knitting itself so tightly that the world seemed made of water, and the pauses between drops had to press themselves thinly into the corners. Thunder shook the bowl of the valley in generous peals that set crockery, answering in cupboards. The bell tower hummed faintly, a low companion note. Lightning walked the ridge, one long stride at a time, touching stone with the finger of day. Yet in the clamor, kindness remained. The gutters, remembering their task, poured steady relief. The old oaks bowed, but did not break. They had learned long ago how to give way without surrender. Roofs held, chimneys wore their dark wet, as if it were a winter scarf. In the barn, the mare turned her head to press her nose against her foal's neck, and the foal, who had not heard such drums before, found the courage in that warm breath to lower his own and chew slowly, then lick, then sigh. In kitchens, the smell of stew moved through rafters, and on stovetops, kettles exhaled quiet counterpoints to the thunder's base. The dragon, seeing a quince tree lean too far by the parsonage, exhaled a slow ribbon of warmth from his cave. Not a blast, not a spectacle, just a thread, the way one might pass a shawl to a friend who is not asked but might be cold. The warmth slipped through the rain, lost and found, lost and found, and when it reached the garden, it turned the errand of a gust aside, so the quince bent, trembled, and then stood a fraction surer. No one in the parsonage knew why the sudden tilt slowed. They only knew the fruit would not fall before it was sweet. The afternoon curled into evening without anyone noticing when, exactly, the light changed. Lanterns were lit earlier than usual and set in windows to steady the sight of those who must cross the square, even in weather. The miller, weighing his steps, paused to let the lightning finish counting before he made his dash. In the schoolroom, the old teacher closed his book and let the children draw the storm. Long slashes and soft swirls, houses smiling shyly under giant umbrellas, a dragon in one corner perhaps, drawn by a brave hand as an enormous cat with wings and the kindest eyes anyone could imagine. By nightfall, the rain's insistence had gentled a little. The drops were smaller, the intervals longer, as if the sky, having said everything loudly, wished to repeat itself softly so the meaning would settle. Thunder retreated to the edges, grumbling like an old man who has found his chair. Lightning closed its hands and flickered only to show that it had not yet quite gone home. The roads shone like long fish in the lantern light. The streams, newly flush, sang slightly higher notes against their stones. Inside houses, extra blankets were shaken out, not because of cold, but because of comfort. Parents moved with the competent storms. Give to grown-ups the calm inventory of candles, latches, towels, tea. Children, who share the weather inside their chests, bounced a little between windows and beds, between curiosity and unease. Even those who loved the spectacle felt, now that the dark had deepened, the bigness of the sky in their small bones. They brushed their teeth to the tempo of thunder's last low speech. They climbed into beds that smelled like lavender and clean linen, and watched the windows as if the night were a friendly theater, staging a slow blue play. Up at the cave, the dragon listened to the storm's coda. He had not moved far. He kept his heavy head lowered so that the moss would not be bruised by its sway. Now and then he breathed out, and the breath spread through the cave and into the rain. When a sudden downburst pushed toward a rookery where the nestlings' heads were still ridiculous and bare, he added a warm eddy to the air so that the worst of the wind skipped just enough to keep small beaks from chattering in fear. The rook mothers did not thank the weather. They simply tucked tighter. Gratitude, like rain, often moves without a name. Slowly, the storm drew its hems from the hedges and lifted its shoulders from the hills. The bell rope hung still in its tower. The oak leaves released what they had held, drop by shining drop. The rafters, which had been a little musical under the thunder, fell back into their ordinary silence. The last flash of lightning was small and domestic, more a candle snuff than a flourish. The last thunder was softer than a door closing down the lane. The valley listened to the aftersound, the way the air feels when a choir has stopped singing, and the notes are still arranging themselves in the room. The villagers, easing their shoulders, said goodnight to one another between rooms and floors. Somewhere, a father told a child that storms are the sky turning its soil, breaking up the clods, getting more air to the roots of things. Somewhere, a mother kissed a damp curl from a face and said that loudness and meanness are not the same, and that sometimes loud things leave kindness behind when they go. Water ran from every edge, 100 new rivulets learning their way. The streams, swollen and pleased, filled their banks, and then, remembering their manners, did not overstep. The scent in the valley was rich and clean, leaf, earth, stone, like a page that has been written and then dried. Lamps went out one by one. The wind, which had knocked and called and insisted, now rested its head against the eaves and slept. And yet, though the storm had passed, sleep did not come easily to all. The sky's drums had taught the children's hearts a rhythm that would take a while to forget. Dreams resisted their own doors. Little feet found floorboards, and little whispers found hallways. It was the village's turn to hum now, to make its own quiet, to meet the quiet returning from the sky. The night would need help, a particular kind of help that knew how to gather scattered thoughts and lay them down like smooth stones. Up at the cave, the dragon lifted his head. The storm had gone, but its echo still turned in small chests below. He listened, the way one listens for a far bell, and he heard it. The thin thread of wakefulness tugged by leftover thunder. His breath deepened. The moon, shy behind a final veil of cloud, prepared her soft lantern, and Moon Valley, washed and gleaming, waited for the next kindness to arrive. After a storm, the world remembers. The roofs remember the weight of water. The hedges remember the grip of wind. Even the air remembers the thunder's low instruction and keeps a quiet bass note tucked somewhere in its wide chest. In Moon Valley, that remembering lived softly on the windowsills and along the floorboards, and in the folds of curtains that were still a little damp at their hems. The night had resumed its hush, but it was a hush with a recent history, a hush that had learned to be steady after being shaken. Inside the village houses, the comfort work began. Parents moved in the unshowy way of those who have weathered many nights. They lifted blankets by their corners so that warm air would bloom beneath. They shook out pillows until feathers settled like light snow. They set cups where small hands could reach them and tucked a dry cloth over the lip so no one would startle at a sudden chill. They made the old assurances sound new. Listen, the rain is gentler now, and the wind has gone to sleep, and the lightning is only counting its steps toward morning. Rooms, hearing those sentences, obliged by feeling safer. But children carry the sky inside them. The thunder that had rolled over the hills still rolled a little in their ribs. The flash that had written white lines across the ridge still flickered under their eyelids. Even the rain's crowding voice, though now a hush along the gutters, found a way to repeat itself in the tiniest tap against thoughts that had not yet learned to settle. One child dreamed with eyes open, watching the window as if a friendly giant might wave from the other side of the glass. Another lay on his side, counting heartbeats as if they were sheep of a new, invisible flock. A baby, in the smallest cradle, cycled between sighs and soft complaints. A weather vane on a kitchen wind that had not quite stilled, so the night filled with light stirrings, the kind that make houses seem to breathe. Mattress ropes answered gentle shifts. Boards spoke their old, creaking languages. We are here, we are here. The wood stove kept its ember gossip. The stairs remembered each child's step and tried to soften it more than usual. Doors were opened just enough to let a reassuring rectangle of hall light in, then closed to a line, then opened again. A cat, philosophical and damp around the whiskers, made its round from hearth to window to foot of bed, and settled finally where some small ankle needed its quiet, consistent weight. In one narrow cottage by the square, a girl named Hattie, whose bedtime bravery usually outpaced her years, found that her courage had gone to sit by the door and think, leaving her with questions that felt larger than the room. "Do storms know our names?" she whispered, not quite sure if asking would wake the wind again. Her mother, smoothing the comforter, smiled in the dark. "They know the valleys," she said, "and the valley knows ours. We are inside that knowing." Hattie touched the comforter's edge, as if to test the fabric of this idea, and it held. Across the lane, a boy named Theo, who collected small truths the way others collect marbles, lay listening for the precise moment when the rain became more memory than weather. He tried to measure it by the gutter's voice. He tried counting heartbeats between drops on the sill. He even tried stillness, the hardest measure of all. But every time he almost knew, he also almost worried about the birch by the well, about the lamb with the crooked ear, about the jar of honey left too near the window. What ifs filed through his room like polite guests who forgot to leave. His father, who knew that minds like Theo's need invitations to rest, came to the doorway and leaned there. "What if," he said, "you let the rain do the counting now, and you keep the sleeping? You can swap again in the morning." Theo considered the fairness of that bargain, and because fairness is a language he speaks, he nodded and turned the pillow to its cooler side. Somewhere near the mill, twins in a loft bed practiced bravery in a duet. "I wasn't scared," one said. "I was excited." "I was both," said the other, because truth, when told by siblings, often arrives in pairs. They linked their ankles the way they do when the house creaks. A promise bridged with two sets of toes. Their grandmother, on the pallet by the stove, called softly up the ladder, "Sleep is like soup. The longer it simmers, the better it island. Lie back and let the night cook." The twins giggled at the picture of their two heads as round dumplings bumping gently in dreaming broth. And this was exactly the gentleness their bodies needed to begin their slow float towards sleep. Not everyone stayed in beds. A few padded into kitchens to sit with kettles in the company of tired adults. There were murmured petitions for one more sip, the brave request to listen together just for a little, and the relief of a lap that said yes. A father ran his palm along the window glass to feel how the cool had softened. A mother folded a towel over a small pair of shoulders, as though the towel were a sentence. "You are safe. You are held." In the church, where the door latch had a way of being slightly too loud, the bell rope swayed once with no hand on it, and the sexton, who believed in both physics and blessings, looked up and whispered, "Amen," because some acknowledgments fit both. Above all this tender disarray, the moon finally freed herself from the last thin veil and laid a soft road of light across the valley. It touched rooftops as if checking foreheads for fever, and found only the warmth of ordinary life. It brightened puddles into silver coins children would skip over tomorrow. It slipped across doorknobs and turned them into mild moons of their own. And it leaned, very gently, into windows where wakeful eyes watched back. One by one, the eyes blinked slower. The moon likes to be met with blinks. They are the sky's favorite punctuation. Still, a restlessness threaded the night. A careful, persistent thread. It ran from crib to loft, from cottage to farmhouse, looping through quiet breaths and almost sleeps. It was not trouble. It was the simple after-sound of thunder, the way a bell continues in the bones long after the bell itself is quiet. The valley could have lowered another blanket of silence over the roofs and hoped that would be enough. But in Moon Valley, needs are not hushed, they are answered. Up on the stone slope, at the mouth of the moss-curtained cave, the dragon listened. He had been listening all along the way. Mountains listen, not with ears, but with a wide, patient attention that makes room for other beings to be themselves. Now he tilted his great head, and the motion, though large, disturbed nothing more than a riffle in the moss. He could hear the after-thunder in the children. He could hear the half-questions in the adults who had already answered so many. He could hear a baby's brave but uncertain sigh, and the steadier breath of a cat who had already forgiven the sky for being loud. He could hear the river, pleased with itself, and consequently a touch talkative. He could hear his cave's own heart, a cool, slow drip that never rushed anyone for anything. His breath deepened, and the cave answered by warming along the stone, a reminder of hearths in the valley below. He lifted one wing slightly, then the other, stretching the long, fine bones until the membranes hummed the faintest note, like two strings plucked far apart, yet tuned to kindness. From his scales, the inner light that he usually keeps banked rose a shade brighter, the way embers do when a poker listens and then touches the right place. The cave glowed like dusk gathered in safe hands. The owls approved in their sober way and made a mild exchange of places on the branch that leaned into the opening. He did not hurry. Hurrying would have been a disagreement with the night, and he had no wish to disagree with anything that was trying its best. Instead, he breathed again long and low, a sound like a calm sea turning itself once and settling. The sound moved down the path ahead of him. It entered the firs and left them a fraction less bristled. It slipped between the birches and smoothed their white sleeves. It found the alder and persuaded its leaves to loosen their careful fists. It crossed stone and field and fence and river with the easy authority of water, finding a channel prepared for it years ago. In the village, several children turned their heads on pillows at once, as if someone had straightened a picture slightly crooked on a wall, only they could see. The baby in the cradle turned his sigh into a long exhale that uncurled his fists. Hattie, who had asked whether storms know names, said her own name quietly into the dark and felt an answer. Not a word, but a soft recognition, like a large, warm presence, smiling without showing any teeth. Theo decided, with the precision of the just, that the rain had indeed become mostly a memory. He placed this truth on the shelf of his mind where the sure things go, and closed the cupboard door. Adults felt it too, though they would tell it later with small words. The father at the window rubbed away the last fog with his sleeve and found the glass already clear. The mother with the towel eased it from her child's shoulders because the child no longer shivered. The sexton sat back on his heels and for once allowed the bell rope to be exactly as still as it wished. The twins in the loft counted together to 15 and realized they could not remember if they had reached 10. And this, between twins, is a known sign of impending sleep. The dragon stepped to the lip of the cave and looked out. Moonlight made a path across his scales, as if the sky itself wished to travel with him. He spread his wings halfway, and then paused, feeling the night's fabric for its strongest threads. His descent would not be a spectacle. The valley had had enough of shows. It would be, instead, a kindness moving through the air in the shape of a dragon, no louder than snow falling on a wool hat. He folded himself forward, balanced in the old careful way, and let the earth release him. For a breath, 1, 2. The cave behind him held the precise imprint of his warmth, and then began, dutifully, to cool. The moss lowered like eyelids closing. The owls lifted briefly, then settled back to their ledger of small, important flights, and the dragon, with the patience of weather that heals what weather has stirred, entered the valley's night, the way a lullaby enters a room already dark and waiting. Below, the roofs brightened as he passed, not with fear or with fame, but with recognition, as if the houses themselves remembered an old agreement to be cared for. Children turned toward the windows without waking. Parents' shoulders eased, and cups were set down without the small clink of worry. The river lowered its voice by a note it had been meaning to lower for an hour. The village, still awake in shy, scattered places, did not know to prepare a welcome. None was needed. The welcome was in the need itself, already open like a door with a latch that remembers every hand, and the dragon answering not thunder, not tales, but the simplest of invitations, the ones written in breath and hush, came down, as gently as moonlight spilling from a cloud, to lay his great quiet presence across the night. The first thing the village felt was not a shadow, It was a softening, like the way a hand hovers above a candle and calms the flame without touching it. Windows that had been holding the night at arm's length drew it closer, the way a child pulls a blanket to the chin. The lanes seemed to smooth their stones. Even the rainwater, gathered in shallow bowls along the ruts, lost its quicksilver shiver and lay still, as if listening. High above, the dragon leaned into the moonlight's patient lane and began to descend. He did not fall, or plunge, or dive. His great body recognized the valley's shape the way an old song recognizes its key, and he entered that keynote by unhurried note. He let the air meet him first nose to breeze, brow to brightness, so that the night could learn him again and be reassured. His wings unfolded with the soft authority of book, leaves knowing where they mean to lie, membranous stretched thin as vellum, strong as the resolve to be kind and the fine. Branching bones within gleamed like silver filigree under the moon. When he lifted each wing to test the air's familiar weight, the moss at the cave's mouth rose and fell, a green breath, and then settled back with the contentment of a quilt smoothed by gentle hands. He stepped off the stone. For a heartbeat, the mountain kept his shape, the way the memory of a friend lingers in a doorway just after they've gone. Then the shape thinned to moonlight, and the dragon became, to the cave, a warmth moving elsewhere, a promise kept in motion. The night accepted him. Air gathered along the curves of his chest and belly, flowed around the columns of his limbs, and wrote soft lines of lift beneath the vast pages of his wings. Each downstroke was a quiet syllable. Each upstroke was silence completing the word. In the hush between, he floated supported not only by air, but by the valley's long-standing habit of making room for what is gentle. The stars watched his passing without blinking, the way elders observe a ceremony whose steps they know by heart. He did not hurry, because hurrying is a bruise left on time. Instead, he allowed the geography of kindness to guide him, the slow slant from ridge to pasture, the careful dip over orchard and roofline, the respectful arc around the bell tower, whose rope still remembered thunder. It chose not to cast a large shadow across a single house, but to stretch a thinner, softer tincture of dark across many, so that each bed felt a mild dimming as of a cloud wandering over a lazy summer field. Beneath him, the roofs brightened not with fear, not with any vivid alarm, but with a kind of attention. Thatch drank moonlight and let it go again, as if passing a cup around a circle of friends. Slate wore a cool sheen like breath upon a mirror. Guttering, newly eased from the day's work, glimmered in narrow smiles. Where rain had pooled, his reflection slid across like a slow-cast net, not trapping anything, only gathering a moment's likeness and letting it go. As he lowered, he breathed. His breath came long and warm, a tide that does not pretend to be the sea, and it moved across the village in patient strokes. It crept under doorways with the permission of the gaps houses keep for friendly air. It softened the crisp edge of a curtain's hem. It lifted the corners of a coverlet and tucked them again as a mother's hand would. It found the dry branch laid ready in a hearth and asked it kindly not to crack at this hour, and the branch agreed. It crossed a cradle and discovered the tiny fist that had been clenched around a last echo of thunder. The fist opened, the fingers surprised to find themselves so small and yet so perfectly enough. He kept close to the contours he knew. The poplar near the mill tall, correct, unbotherably, received a small bow in passing. The alder, always murmurous, always a little in love with the water's voice, heard the dragon's breath and found it to be a relative, wind from a gentler branch of the same family. The birches offered up their pale arms to the light and watched with their particular stillness as the dragon's glow sketched itself across their narrow bands. Even the old oak, who had often played audience to storms and festivals and market days and grief, made room in his wide idea of the world for this too. A large, quiet presence, riding ease into the dark. Bats adjusted their arcs by a hair's breadth and found no turbulence. Owls, whose minds are tuned to the useful and the true, made no complaint at his shadow, but kept their ledger of small flights with an extra check mark for the night's unusual peace. A hedgehog paused at the lip of a puddle, nose lifted, and then went on, assured by a warm scent like cedar and rain on dust. Mice, running narrow errands, did not scatter. They continued, a little straighter in the whiskers, as if a good rule, be not startled without cause, had just been reissued from a kindly authority. As he passed over the church, the bell rope stirred once, an inch of considerate sway, as though giving a bow back. The sexton, drowsing in a chair he'd promised himself he wouldn't use for sleeping, woke just enough to think, it's gidder now than quiet itself, and fell into a sleep that mended the seam of a day, undone by weather. The dragon turned, a wide arc over the square. The lamplight in a handful of windows thinned as curtains were drawn, then thickened as they were adjusted by hands that had not meant to fuss but chose to anyway. In one of those windows, Hattie sat cross-legged, chin on knees, the question about storms still warming in her chest like a small coal. She saw only a deepening of the dark, the kind that makes room for sleep rather than hiding from it. And yet, she felt noticed her particular little self within the big valley, noted down by something that kept kind records. 2 houses away, Theo lay on his side rehearsing the plan to sleep that had not quite performed yet. He felt a change in the room, the way a mathematician feels the arrival of a proof. Not flashy, not loud, but certainly, and all at once, the rain's last monosyllables at the sill seemed to arrange themselves into a sentence with a period. He breathed, counted 1 very reasonable sheep, and forgot what number came next, a success he accepted as evidence that bargains fairly made can indeed be kept. The dragon lowered another measure. His wing edges, now only a sweep above chimney pots, trimmed the air so neatly that the smoke from a late kettle chose to ribbon, not tumble. He took care passing the parsonage kins, which had kept its shape, and gave it a breath of sweetness suitable to fruit not yet at rest. He skimmed the mill pond without waking its little citizens, and left behind him a path of smoothing, a visibly gentle hush, traveling across the water like a rumor that kindness had been confirmed. Frogs altered the tempo of their choir to a slower, contented measure and announced to the reeds that they were, in fact, perfectly fine. No door opened to greet him, but many doors relaxed upon their hinges. No song rose to meet him, but the unison of settled kitchens, a spoon set down, a chair eased back, a long breath cancelled into a John composed a music better than any fanfare. In lofts and on pallets and under kilts thin with years and thick with use, bodies released the grip they had not known they were holding. Even the walls, which remember drafts better than they remember spring, seemed to lean, very slightly, toward the middle of rooms, as if agreeing to keep what warmth they had. The dragon angled, then, toward the green that gathered the houses like a small sea gathers islands a common, a lawn, a square where markets are held, and news is exchanged, and children understand that grass, here, is for running upon. It did not intend to land, not yet, but to pass low enough for the village to know, without fully knowing that something large and benign had chosen to be near. Nearness, when it is gentle, is a sedative. He decreased his height until his shadow stitched briefly across the green, threaded the paths, and unspooled harmlessly at the far hedge. A sleepy dog lifted its head, and finding the air rewritten with calm, thumped its tail twice in agreement and lay down again. A candle flame, testing the draft by a kitchen ledger, ceased its little argument and stood to attention, then softened, then slept. A mother halfway up a stair with a glass of water for a child who had asked for a 3rd time and discovered that the thirst had resolved itself into the larger drink of sleep. She stood a moment, smiling at nothing anyone would see, and carried the water down again, because it felt right to leave the night unburdened. The dragon's breath continued its low, warm tide. It found the twins those dumplings in simmering soup, and spun an extra curl of steam around their dreams just for pleasure. It found the baby, and firmed the pillow's edge, so that the small head would not roll toward worry. It found the baker, up too late, and puffed the flour on his work table into a tiny snow that drifted into a miniature drift, a kit reminder that morning will be serviceable whether or not loaves are scored perfectly in the dark. He traced the lanes once more, not for inspection or claim, but the way one strokes the rim of a bowl to hear whether the clay sings true. The village sang true. The note had been thin and a little bright before. Now it settled to a rounder tone, bell-like but not solemn, more like pewter tapped by a friendly spoon, satisfied not with himself, but with the way peace had taken his invitation. He lifted slightly, letting the air speak first again. All the while, he kept the moon close. Her light lay across his back like a shawl that had learned the shape of his shoulders. Where her brightness could not reach, the soft inner glow of his scales offered a second moon, paler and nearer, diffused like a promise in fog. Between those two lights he carried no darkness that hurt. His shadow was simply a pause, a rest in the measure, a comma placed exactly where the sentence needed to breathe. When at last he had ridden the lanes of air that the valley kept for trusted travelers, he turned his long head toward the hillside where houses thinned and gardens grew larger. There, between a sleeping orchard and the green, he chose a height just above the talused elm and moved as one does when passing a crib light-footed, slower than slow, listening for any steer that means more or less, or just so. What he heard at last was the sound a village makes when it remembers how to sleep, the sigh released from many chests at once, the small animal of every worry curling itself and closing its eyes, averted there, enormous and impossibly quiet, for the span of a dozen steady breaths. Then he began to draw himself broader, to stretch those great wings until their edge spanned street to street like the suggestion of an embrace. Not yet the blanket that would come. First, the approach, the gentle descent fulfilled. He raised his head to the moon, allowed her to find the last angle of his brow, and lowered it to the valley again. The night returned the look, unafraid. Where thunder had taught a rhythm too fast, his beating heart taught a slower one. Where rain had spoken loudly, his breath said only, hush, hush, hush. And Moon Valley, rewarmed and re-wondered, answered. In the next part of the night, his wings would widen, his scales would glimmer like 1,000 tame fireflies, and the children, who had held on for so long, would finally let go and float. But for now, in the perfect in-between, the dragon hung in the moonlight like a lullaby waiting to be sung, a kindness poised at the lip of giving, a great calm folded carefully over a village that had remembered to ask for rest. There is a moment in every lullaby after the first notes have introduced themselves and before the last notes promise tomorrow, when the song seems to open its hands and hold the listener completely. The dragon reached that moment now. He drew one long, unhurried breath and let his wings widen until their edges traced the shape of Moon Valley's sleep, street to street, roof to roof, garden to garden. His vast pinions unfurled like soft, moon-made sails, and the night fitted itself beneath them with a grateful, almost audible ease. He did not touch down. His body remained a floating hill of gentleness, the air cradling him with the competence of an old friend. But his wings, oh, and his wings, how they learned the village. Over the schoolhouse roof, they curved a fraction lower, as if to tuck in the chalk dust and the small courage left behind by spelling tests and jump ropes. Over the bakery, they sheltered the last proving loaf, a round breath of dough that would wake early and become morning. Over the parsonage, they paused a heartbeat longer, acknowledging the quince tree's brave keeping. Over the square, they widened so that every window felt the same tender, dimming the dear, familiar hush of a cloud passing on a summer noon, but slower, kinder, deliberate. From his scales rose the faintest light, as if each one remembered a star it had once held and decided, just for this night, to share its memory. It began small, the way fireflies begin one, and then another, and then a third far off, and a fourth near at hand, until the shimmer gathered into a quiet constellation that did not compel the eye but welcomed it. The light did not glare. It breathed. It drifted across the village in a slow, even tide, settling into hedges, glancing off puddles, slipping along fences, as if the rails themselves had learned to glow with reassurance. In the mill pond, his reflection turned the water's skin to a sheet of patient silver. Frogs, who had been keeping a brisk conversation about weather, lost interest in debate and sang a round, satisfied note instead. The pond's smallest citizens, water boatmen, not great admirers of change, found that this was not change but kindness in another shape, and went on with their tiny oar strokes, calmer than before. A dragonfly, late to bed and opal-eyed with the last of stormlight, folded its glassy wings and let the dragon's glow rest upon them as if it were dew. In cottages, little hands unclasped their last vigilant fists. A baby's thumb, which had been hovering uncertainly near a lip, found its place without fuss and slept there as if it had been meant to. Hattie, beneath her quilt of stitched moons and meadows, loosened the worry in her chest the way a seam is loosened by a patient needle. It didn't break, it widened just enough to let sleep through. He knows the valley's name. She thought not afraid of the pronoun anymore, and felt the answering warmth move across her like a cat's slow tread. Here I am, and here, and here. Theo, who had made a fair bargain with rest, felt the room's arithmetic solve itself. The ticking at the sill joined the clock's mild heart, and together they set a tempo the mind could step to and then sit within. He arranged his thoughts on their shelves and found, with a private smile, that his oldest, steadiest truth had climbed down and was waiting by the bed like an old dog. You are small and you are safe, and the world is very large and very kind tonight. He slept as though he were agreeing politely to something that had long been prepared for him. The twins, dumplings turned to cloudberries now, drifted in the sweet broth of their dreams, their ankles unhooked, their hands, which had held each other through Thunder's long monologue, floated apart, and then found new tasks. One curled around a bit of blanket that felt like a hill. The other made a bridge for a small wooden horse to cross into a meadow no one had to mow. Their grandmother, soup maker of similes, smiled in her sleep and snored a soft, friendly snore, as if punctuating the night with commas instead of periods. The dragon's breath became a lullaby without words. It moved in long, even measures, the way a tide writes the same sentence again and again upon a beach, and means it more each time. Hush, it said, and the hedges settled their leaves. Hush, it said, and the barn cat, who had set herself the impossible task of watching 3 corners at once, chose one corner, then none, and dreamed of mice who brought her violets and asked for advice about being small. Hush, it said, and the bell rope whose fibers still held Thunder's memory released it, strand by strand, until only the bell's most patient note remained, audible to no ear and obvious to every heart. Beneath the wing's wide shade, lamplight took a slower shape. Flames that had been upright with attention softened into petal forms, curled and closed. A last kettle settled itself and ceased to think about boiling. The thin smoke from a single late chimney kept to its ribbon and did not tangle. A chair that had rocked a little too long, as if trying to finish someone else's day, stilled and learned stillness again. He shifted once, not to correct, but to complete, and when he did, his scales lifted their quilt of light a shade brighter. The village gleamed as firefly constellations spilled softly across it, over lintels and lint, over broom bristles and bread knives, over quilts patched by 3 generations and 1 pair of eager new hands learning to stitch. The light found its way into cupboards, not to inventory or to judge, but to warm the place where cups nest together. You belong, it seemed to say, to cups and to cupboards both. It settled on a child's book left open on a sill, midway through a story about a brave onion. The onion would be fine. Even onions, in Moon Valley, learn they are more than tears. In a stable at the edge of the village, a mare breathed into her foal's ear and discovered her own breath had grown steadier. The foal's knees, which had entertained a small staccato jitter all evening, forgot their choreography and folded. The whole small horse turned slowly, carefully, as if arranging itself upon a cloud. In a coop, the hens made their ancient little hairpin sounds and tucked their heads the spirit's preferred direction. Even the rooster, who suffers from ambition at peculiar hours, postponed opinion until dawn. The dragon listened to the sleep he'd gathered. It made a sound like cloth being smoothed on a table before the bread is cut. It rose and fell in a collective tide, each breath a boat. He could feel, in his vast, quiet chest, the way these small hearts learned his rhythm and then made it their own. He adjusted the angle of a wingtip above the square and felt the air knit itself tighter across the thatch. He rounded his shoulders over the lane that led to the mill and felt the lane thank him by becoming a little lane-shaped sigh. Clouds, late guests in a hospitable sky, arrived as thin veils and wandered under his wings, discovering to their surprise that his light could pass through them and still be soft. On any other night, the clouds would have been noticed for their own silver. But tonight, they chose to be background lace behind the shawl, because some gentlenesses are glad to be second. The moon, pleased to share, poured herself along the dragon's back, and where her bright could not reach his light continued, a milky echo promising no corner forgotten. At the far end of the village, where the road begins to imagine other places, a solitary shepherd leaned at his gate and considered the extraordinary ordinary of the hour. He had been a boy who feared shadows and had become a man who recognized them, companions that deepen the world rather than bite it. He saw no dragon in the strict sense, no outline a schoolchild could copy, but he saw the evidence, calm laid evenly as dew, the particular, unmistakable ease of creatures whose bodies have been given permission to rest. Nearness, he said aloud, because saying small truths aloud feeds them, and the ewes shifted, satisfied, as if the word were hay. The dragon lowered his head and breathed a longer, slower line. In the corner cottage, where a child with a winter cough had been keeping a vigilant, squeaky watch, the cough found itself invited to a gentler rhythm and accepted. In the big house on the green, where busyness breeds even in darkness, the ledger closed its own cover, as if embarrassed to be opened so late. In the little house with the crooked stoop, the mouse family neighbors of his cave cousins finished their nightly errands and sat together in the wall's warm seam, whiskers forward, pleased by a peace they could not name and did not need to. From the dragon's wings, a small snow of light sifted down, nothing to sweep, nothing to melt, just a drift of comfort that chose the exact places where it would matter most. A cracked teacup's handle felt stronger, a toy's frayed ear, mended twice, learned to stand a fraction prouder. A letter tucked behind a clock became, quite definitely, a letter kept rather than a letter forgotten. A picture on a mantel, two faces, and a dog brightened enough to be noticed by someone who needed to remember why morning is worth meeting. The village's sound thinned and then thinned again, the way a stream narrows near a culvert and then opens into a pool. Children's breathing found the pooled end. The last adult thoughts lists, small regrets, small triumphs lined up for inspection and were stamped gently. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Even the owls, auditors of the night, made their tallied flights with lazy tails and wrote fewer notes in the margins. The dragon's task, if task, is the right word for a love practiced, as naturally as breathing approached its sweet completion. He had covered the village like a blanket. He had lifted fear and set it carefully on a shelf, where even fear seemed content to sleep. He had brightened the dark not to banish it, but to bless it. Now he drew his wings inward by an inch, testing the night's new strength without him. It held. The hush he'd gathered did not scatter. It stayed, as a song stays in a room after the singer has taken a bow. He hovered a while longer, because tenderness is thorough. He listened for any stray wakefulness and found only the pleasant kind. The baker's warm drowse, the shepherd's word repeating itself into dream, the murmur of streams rehearsing tomorrow's glitter. He let a final veil of light sift into the square, and turned his long head toward the hills. Before he lifted, he looked once more along the lanes, not to admire his work, but to admire the village's quiet courage. Look how they rest when given the chance, his great heart seemed to say. Look how sleep returns when called by gentleness. Then he rose a little, a breath above the chimneys, and the wing that had been a comfort withdrew without draught or loss. The air closed kindly behind it, the firefly shimmer of his scales dimmed to a memory, sweet as a dream that knows when to finish. Above him, the moon lifted her silver sewing and began to stitch a closing seam along the edge of night. All across Moon Valley, sleep lay like soft rain after good weather. The children floated in their boats of breath. The grown-ups set down the last of their weight. The valley itself, that careful hand of hills, cupped all of it and sighed. And high above, the dragon turned toward the cave he loved, ready to rest his own great head upon his paws, the better to watch the final part of the night unfold. A village held, a moon content, and a peace so complete that even dreams, when they came, chose to whisper. Peace, when it returns, does not arrive with trumpets. It comes on slippered feet, pauses at every threshold to be sure it is wanted, and enters with the tact of a dear friend who knows where the cups are kept. In Moon Valley, peace moved like that, room to room, crib to cradle, barn to byre, touching what had been stirred and letting it be still again. The night, newly mended, breath in its full length, the village answered with a soft communal sigh that unknotted the last small threads of worry. The dragon hovered one breath longer above the roofs, listening the way a harbor listens to its moorings after a storm. Sleep held, hush held, kindness held. Satisfied, he narrowed the wide arc of his wings, folding them by patient measures until the night reclaimed its ordinary distances. Where the span of his comfort had been, the moonlight flowed back in, sewing with silver the places where his shade had laid a gentle hand. A few firefly bright motes lingered as if reluctant to leave their watch, then drifted upward like blessings going home. They rose not sharply, but as a slow hill might decede to become a cloud. The air helped him, bearing the weight of gratitude with easy grace. Chimneys that had enjoyed his nearness let go their straitened smoke and wore only the faintest halos of steam. The elm with the honest heart set its leaves to rights, leaf by leaf, in the tidy way trees have of resuming themselves. At the parsonage, the quince settled into its roots as a tired guest leans into the chair that fits best. The mill pond returned to its night face flat as a polished pewter plate, reminding the stars of their plain, beloved shapes. Inside houses, doors that had been left a careful finger width open were eased to the width of a whisper. A ladle, forgotten on a counter, found its bowl in the dark with the little click that means tomorrow will be convenient. The baker's last yawn finished itself and turned into the first good sleep he had allowed in a month. The twins dreamed the kind of dreams that have no plot and every comfort. Hattie's quilt grew heavier by exactly the weight of a promise kept. Theo's mind, having filed its final proof beneath the topic heading Enough, wandered into a meadow where numbers bloomed like harmless flowers and could be picked or left without consequence. Cats made the rounds of their households, and finding no duties, lay themselves down at the socks of chairs with a thud of practical contentment. Dogs, closer to doors, took up the slow, vigilant breathing that says, "I will listen while you sleep." But even their ears drooped a little, as if the village's peace were a tune they had been waiting to hear and could nap to without missing the melody. In the stable, the mare dreamed of green slopes and, waking briefly to nudge her foal, found the foal already deep in the unself-conscious sleep of the very young. The foal twitched once, perhaps at the memory of the dragon's soft light, and the twitch became a gallop through a field where the grass understood every step. The bell rope in the church dangled exactly as ropes dream of dangling, plumb, patient, certain of its purpose, and equally certain there was no purpose now. The sexton, in his chair, smiled in sleep, a small upward curve, that made his whole face seem to remember its younger self. On the teacher's desk, the book of simple truths lay open to a blank page that did not hurry to be written. Truths, like bread, are best when allowed to rise. And up he went, the dragon, returning along the lanes of air he knew by heart. The moon stayed with him, companionable as ever, draping his back in a shawl of light and guiding the long sweep of his tail past the taller pines. Where her brightness thinned, his inner glow traced a pale second river, so that he was followed both by a shadow and by a softness, and caress. Owls marked his passing and did not need to write it down. Bats, tidy keepers of the ledger of insects, continued their loops unperturbed. The hedgehog by the puddle, work finished, curled perfectly and let the sky tuck it in. As the dragon approached the stone slope, the cave saw him before he saw the cave. It had been keeping his place the way a faithful chair keeps the shape of a back, and now, recognizing the slow return of its friend, it offered what caves can offer: cool acceptance, the long patience of stone. The moss at the mouth lifted as if to smell the night on him and to contribute its own green scent in exchange. Ferns leaned a millimeter, curious and pleased. The narrow path, whose pebbles had memorized the press of his great paws, glittered with a faint dampness like a line drawn by a quiet, laughing brook. He entered with the same courtesy he had brought to the village, not as a conqueror returning from some necessary deed, but as a keeper putting his hands back into familiar pockets. His claws touched down with a restraint that made no scratch. His wings refolded, thumb bones first, then the long ribs, each crease a decision to rest. He lay along the curve of the cave, aligning his vastness with the stone's old geometry, until his size was simply a quality of the room, like warmth or dusk. The breath he let out then was as long as the valley, and the valley heard it, not with ears, with roofs, with fields, with that thin seam of cool that runs along every windowsill when the night has properly taken hold. It was a breath that did not ask anything to change, only invited every small thing to be exactly what it was, with a little less effort. Hedges softened into their hedgeness. Paths were content to be paths. The river, which had talked over itself for hours, discovered it could lower its voice and mean more. The moon lifted higher, stepping from branch to branch of the sky, until she stood above the dragon like a lantern hung at the perfect height. Her light poured into the valley through the cave's opening and lay in pale lozenges on the floor, pooling around the familiar bowl of river stones he had gathered, catching on the blue-white feather in its niche, touching the old wreath of withered leaves with an affection that refused to call anything finished, merely for being old. The small drip at the back of the cave kept its slow count, now in a meter so calm that even time seemed to nod and agree not to hurry. From his high vantage, the dragon looked once more across Moon Valley. He saw not details. He did not need them now, but the whole, the cupped hand of hills, the sheet of meadow relaxing into its weave, the mild glints where water remembers light, even in darkness, the quilt of roofs, every patch blessed by a child's dream or a grown-up's softened thought. He saw, too, what only watchers see, the way quiet, once gathered, continues by itself. His work was not a possession. It was a gift, whose best quality is that it can be left. Down in the square, the last candle surrendered its flame and sent a wisp upward, a message in a language older than letters. Good night, good night. In the orchard, apples turned their rosy cheeks slightly, as if arranging themselves for a painter who refused to wake. The fields, still damp in the topmost inch, exhaled the day and asked nothing of the dark but its nearness. In the shepherd's lane, the word he had spoken, nearness, lingered like a faint, sweet smoke, and then dissolved into the larger air, which already understood. In the parlor of the house by the well, the old teacher steered. He stretched a hand toward his open book without opening his eyes, and with the fingertip memory of long practice, wrote 5 words on the blank page. Gentleness is a great strength. In the morning, he would smile at the sentence and not remember how it arrived. which is the way of many good thoughts. The dragon settled his head upon his forepaws. The stone received the weight with the relieved acceptance of a friend who has been holding a chair for you in a crowded room. His eyes, large pools of dusk, drifted half-closed, then opened once more to let the moon paint a final, thin line across each dark surface. He did not sleep yet. Guardianship, in its kindest form, is most itself in the hour when vigilance becomes simply attention. He watched the valley not to catch it in error, but to be present for its peace. The moon, pleased, leaned into the long arc of night. She made a silver seam along the dragon's spine, and then stitched that seam to the horizon's hem, so that dragon and valley and sky were a single beautiful garment worn by rest. Beyond the hills, where other valleys invented their own dreams, small winds changed shifts without foos. Stars held their places like attentive ushers. A meteor crossed briefly, no louder than a thought, and was gone. A swift embroidery at the edge of a great calm. When sleep finally found the dragon, it did not come as a plunge, but as a tide that had been quietly rising all along. A warm fullness that lifted him and then set him down upon a shore only he and the stone knew by name. He slept the way mountains sleep, entirely present, entirely at ease. His breath remained the village's second lullaby, so soft now it was indistinguishable from the night's own pulse. Moon Valley slept two children, elders, beasts, and birds, each in the shape that felt most like yes. Dreams visited without urgency. The baker walked a field of flour that drifted like snow and did not need sweeping. The twins rowed a boat made of soup spoons across a lake of laughter. Hattie and Theo flew kites from a hill where wind obeyed only gentleness. The shepherd sat on a gate with the dragon beside him, both of them saying nothing to the full satisfaction of saying nothing. The river dreamed it was a ribbon tied around the valley's wrist, so it would not wander from itself. Near dawn, when the moon begins to loosen her hand and the east rehearses its first pale color, an owl passed the cave silent, competent, and gave one serious blink that meant, in owl, "We will keep the rest of the night." The dragon, asleep, answered without moving, "I know." The cave answered too, with its old stone patience, "I will keep him while he keeps them." And the moon, hearing both, lowered herself by an inch and shone a fraction kinder. If such a thing can be, peace had returned. And not only returned, it had settled in, learned the rooms, found the good chairs, the right shelves, the place where the cups belong. It would not stay forever. No good guest does, but it would stay long enough, and more than long enough to be remembered. When the sun came, it would find a valley rested and ready, bread to be baked, fields to be walked, letters to be answered, small mischiefs to be invented and forgiven. But all that belonged to morning. For now, there was this: a dragon asleep on a mountain, his scales dim as quenched embers, and moon just high enough to watch the last of night's tasks complete themselves. A village folded into its own kind quiet, every heart tucked and breathing. The world, in this corner of it, was held and knew it. And in that knowing, every dream turned lightly, like a page, toward all the beautiful tomorrows that begin with a good night.